Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now today I'm going to rank the Renown films. These were a series of westerns that partnered Randolph Scott and the director Bud Boetticher in the late 1950s. They were called Renown, fact fans, because it was the name Randolph Scott and the producer Harry Joe Brown run together. Now these were a series of very cheaply made westerns, right? And they were often sort of second features, but they've developed a huge cult following. Why? What's so special about these movies? They're fairly straightforward. They're often sort of tales of Randolph Scott, he's kind of like a knight in shining armour moving through the sort of desert of the West, you know. He's very tersely spoken, doesn't say much. He's very upright and tall in the saddle, you know. But he's on some kind of quest, a revenge quest usually. And often in the movies, he comes across a villain character who is a kind of equal. And they almost become friends, allies, but they're antagonists because they both want the same thing, right? So it's quite simple, structured stories. So what's so special about them? Well, I'd like to turn to two pieces of film criticism by the same writer, Paul Schrader. That name may surprise some people. Paul Schrader is better known as a, let's be kind, director of variable output. I mean, he made Blue Collar and Light Sleeper, but he's also made some rather dodgy films. He was, of course, also the scriptwriter of Taxi Driver, for which many of you might know him best. But back in the day, in the late 60s and early 70s, Paul Schrader was a film critic, and he was quite a decent film critic, actually. It's not bad. And he wrote two really interesting pieces of criticism about these movies. The first was, he called them floating poker games. I think that's an ingenious description. Because what happens in these movies, usually in a Western, the guy in the white hat, the hero, and the guy in the black hat, the villain, are opposed to each other, and we know what's good and bad. In these movies, though, what happens is that the hero and the villain are they're almost friends, they're almost mirror images of each other, and often Randolph Scott's character is quite remote, he's quite aloof. Right, we know that he's good, but he's quite difficult to get to know and sympathise with. Whereas the villain is often, he's very crafty and he's funny and he's much more charismatic, he's much more down to earth. We kind of warm towards him. And what we're watching in this movie is these two men sizing each other up. When are they going to make their move? What's their real game? Often in these movies you'll get a bit where the villain, so-called, could kill, right, the hero, or just stand and watch as the hero gets killed in some ambush or something. But they come to their aid and save them. And Randolph Scott will say, well, why did you save me? And he'll say, well, I couldn't rest easy seeing you killed that way. I've got to do it. There's a weird kind of code of honour between these antagonists. So it's like they're playing a game of poker. They're sort of waiting for the other one to call their bluff or to make a move. I think that's a brilliant piece of criticism from Paul Schrader. But the second thing that Paul Schrader talks about is even more interesting to me. Paul Schrader wrote this book. It's called Transcendent Style in Film, right? It's a very famous book. It was an extension of a thesis he was writing at university. Now, what he does in this book is this. He identifies an approach to film style taken by quite highbrow art house directors. He singles out Yasujiro Ozu from Japan, Robert Bresson from France, and Carl Dreyer from Denmark, right? And he says that these directors from different cultures are actually doing a very similar thing. They are stripping away melodrama and easy cuts to emotion to make a more pure kind of mise en scène, right? Based on everyday life and just actions. But coming out of that is this undertow of feeling and emotion. It's like we get closer to the person's soul, right? There's a transcendent feel in what we see, purely through the concentration on the everyday and on people's interactions with each other. It's a kind of anti-melodrama. Now, what's interesting about this seems quite remote from the good old-fashioned entertaining American Western, right? But in his introduction, he lists a lot of directors who sort of click into this style. They may not exhibit it completely, but they're part of it. And one of these directors is Bud Boetticher. How is it that this bunch of 50s, cheapo westerns could be seen as transcendental style? Well, look closely at them. Look how pared down they are. They very seldom go into the town or urban area. They repeat the same elements all over again. I mean, literally, often the dialogue is exactly the same from movie to movie. The elements are the same. The whole structure, a small band of people travelling through country. They've got an aim at one end. Both the hero and the villain want the same thing. Who's going to get it? It's all pared down. The dialogue is, often written by Burt Kennedy, who is a key auteur in these films, is so terse. Sometimes quite amusingly. I love the dialogue that Burt Kennedy writes. He writes things like, "She's a good-looking woman," and then another bloke will go, "She ain't ugly." And this kind of thing goes on all the way through the movie. And a lot of the dialogue is aphorisms. So it'll say like, "A man looks at a woman like that and he gets to feel something down deep inside. A man should have something to look forward to. A man should have something to amount to." It's all that kind of stuff, right? So it's almost like, it's not like characterization dialogue. It's almost like people are either declaiming to each other or they counterpoint each other. So, like, the villain might say to Randolph Scott, "A man could get frightened looking at that smoke on that horizon." And Randolph Scott will say, "You could say that." It's kind of really pared down. There's no sort of easy emotion. There's no easy getting to know the characters. There's a kind of purity about it. And because, Bud Boetticher, partly because he's working on budget, he takes these simple elements and just rearranges them. So the films are very similar to each other. But it's like, that kid's puzzle when you have blocks moving round, just 9 blocks moving around a square, right, to make up an order. These films are a bit like that. They have that purity of a simple game, where the same elements are repeated again and again and again and again, just in different variations. And that's what Paul Schrader is pointing to. There's something very pure about these westerns. They're not full of, the bric-a-brac and the life that comes into other westerns. The world of the saloon bar, the world of the sheriff's office. They're sort of pared away and very pure and very stark. So I know what he means. There's something sort of almost transcendent about them. And that's one of the things I like about these movies. Before we go into the ranking, there's one other thing I want to say about these movies that is very curious, and very few people talk about it. And it's right there in the very first film that sort of acted as the prologue to the cycle, 7 Men from Now. And that is sexual tension. We're used to westerns being about men, right? And men doing what men should do. And these movies, more than anything, about what a guy's got to do. They're always saying, a man should be doing this and a man should be doing that, right? Or they're about the creation of the West, right? Or the American Civil War. But these movies are about sex. Very few commentators talk about this, but look very carefully. Each of the movies has this kind of structure of sexual tension, and it's always the same. There's one woman, and 3 different types of men fight over her. The first is the husband figure, right, who she's with, but he's a bit weak. He's a bit nice, but he's a bit weak. Then there's the Randolph Scott figure, who's tough and aloof and remote, but represents a real man, right? And then there's a third figure, and that is the villainous figure, who actually is the most fun, the most immediately charismatic, the most immediately sexy, but he's bad. And the films are, again, going back to that floating poker games, of these 3 men manoeuvring around each other for the woman. This is investigated in really interesting ways. Like in 7 Men from Now, there's a wonderful piece of dialogue where the heroine says to Randolph Scott, "Look, do you think because my husband can't really look after me that I love him any less?" And Randolph Scott just goes, "Yes," and completely cuts her dead. This is a really important element of these movies. It's very different from Anthony Mann or John Ford or Howard Hawks. It's unique to these films. Okay, let's get to the ranking. Now, I'm going to slightly cheat here. Bud Boetticher and Randolph Scott made 7 westerns together. but two of them don't belong in the renowned cycle. So I'm not going to include Westbound, which by general consent is the least of the films, and I kind of agree with that. I don't mind Westbound, it's okay, but it's pretty pedestrian, it's pretty forgettable. But the other film is Seven Men From Now. Now, I am going to include Seven Men From Now, because Seven Men From Now, it was made by Backjack, which was the production company set up by John Wayne. And originally, John Wayne was due to appear in this film, this script written by Burt Kennedy, which he liked and which he greenlighted. But he couldn't do it because he was making The Searchers. So eventually they settled on Randolph Scott, and this completely revived Randolph Scott's career. You know, he came back from the dead almost. And it was this film, Seven Men From Now, that led on to the others. So I do want to include Seven Men From Now. So at number 6, I'm going to place the last in the renowned cycle, Comanche Station, or as some Americans pronounce it, Comanche. Now this has a really interesting opening sequence where we see Randolph Scott riding through, desert country. And he comes to a tribe of Native Americans. And it looks like he's a sort of Indian trader. And he puts down these goods. They don't seem very happy with them. But eventually they'll take the goods and a Winchester that he gives them. And they give him his trade, which happens to be a woman. And you realise that he's come and traded all these goods to free this woman. But he doesn't really know her. We find out that he's done this because his wife was taken, she was kidnapped years and years ago, and he's been searching for her ever since. And now he's trying to get her out of Indian country, as it was known back then, back to safety. But then up turns Claude Akins. Claude Akins plays the villain in this film. He's a very good actor, I think, Claude Akins. And he wants to collect the bounty for this woman. So now begins a journey back to town, Lordsburg, and we're sort of waiting for either of them to make the move to claim the bounty for this woman. I've put this film 6th, not because it's a bad film, it's a terrific film with beautiful location photography, beautifully paced, great villain in Claude Akins. I've put it bottom because it's the most grizzled, the most sort of downbeat of the 6 films, and it's the one I've watched the least and have the least affection for. It's a bit like, it's a bit of a tough, gristly steak, as opposed to the nice, tender steak of the previous 5 movies. It's also, it kind of gets away with it a bit. It's really a remake of Ride Lonesome. It's got exactly the same structure, exactly the same setup. It even has the same music, right? Do 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 do. You'll know that piece of music if you know these movies. It's the opening credits sequence, and it's a complete lift of the theme tune from Ride Lonesome. You even see the Ride Lonesome tree in the background if you look closely enough, although the plane it's on is now flooded. So it's a great movie, it's very entertaining, but it doesn't have the same charm and the same sense of humour as the first few movies. So that's why I'm putting it bottom, but still a very, very good Western indeed. In 5th place, I'm going to place the original film that started it all, Seven Men From Now. In this one, Randolph Scott used to be a sheriff of this town, but his wife was killed by some people who robbed the Wells Fargo stage. So he decides to go after them, and there's 7 of them, so he's going to kill all 7. But what's interesting about this film is it develops so that, in fact, the revenge plot subsides because a new character comes in the form of a very young Lee Marvin, wearing a very fetching green cravat. Very nice. So Lee Marvin comes into it, and he wants to collect that money. So he's very open with Randolph Scott. He says, look, I'm going to have to go over you. I want that money. And so that the two of them sort of partner up, and there's a sort of mutual respect between them. They almost like each other. They're almost friends. That's the sort of bubbling under element in all of these Randolph Scott westerns. They kind of, in another life, in another world, if things had been different, they might have liked each other, but they don't really. And so that's the setup. Talking of this movie, we really should mention Burt Kennedy. I've mentioned him already, but he's such an important figure, maybe as important as an auteur in these films as Bud Boetticher himself, because Burt Kennedy's script writing is so special. His dialogue is fantastic. It's got a sort of terse Hemingway-esque poetry to it, and it's very funny. And it's really the secret treat of this film. And all the elements that Boetticher will use throughout these films are introduced here, especially that sexual tension I was talking about. But there's some interesting elements that are worth noticing here. Remember that this was originally designed to be a John Wayne film. Now look at the nature of the character that Randolph Scott plays and put John Wayne in that position, especially at the end, the shootout at the end. You know, Randolph Scott hobbles out. He's propped up on his rifle. He's a sort of broken man. When he kills the villain Lee Marvin, there's no sense of euphoria. He just slumps on a boulder. And at the end, you know, when he and the lady in the film, they sort of have this parting conversation, and Scott goes off in a sort of gentlemanly way, and then she tells her driver, I'm going after him. I just don't believe that John Wayne would have worked so well in that situation. Randolph Scott was so perfectly cast in this role. He suits this sort of clipped, quiet, avenging angel, who in a way is so... He's so tied up in his emotions, yet he's a really good, decent man. I don't think Wayne would have inhabited that character as realistically. And that's one of the things I like about this movie so much. Now, in fourth place is Buchanan Rides Alone. Now, there are some movies in life, I've talked about this before on this channel, where they're not the best movies ever. They're not going to win polls. You know, no one's going to ever say they're masterpieces of cinema. But every time you watch them is a special, cuddly feeling of warmth and loviness. They're special friends. Buchanan Rides Alone is a special friend movie to me. I absolutely love this film. Now, in terms of its plot mechanics, it is the most bonkers film in the whole series. It's all over the place. It's the craziest plot. So basically, Randolph Scott, he turns up at the start of the movie and he's a bumptious, happy-go-lucky guy. I'm just rolling along on my mule, you know. And he turns up at this border town between the US and Mexico. And he gets involved in a fight just for the hell of it. And that sets off the whole train of events. It's very odd. And the film, the plot, goes all over the place. It's not got that sort of linear type progression of the other movies. It's just... You know, 1 minute that he's, you know, Randolph Scott's locked up, then he's not locked up, then he's having a chase, then he's locked up again. It just goes all over the place, right? And most of the film is not really about Randolph Scott. It's about something else. It's about the three brothers who run this border town. And they are the most interesting characters in the film. So, at the top, the brother Simon, he's the local bigwig. He's the sort of businessman who runs the town. It's his town, right? Then he's got the brother, played by Barry Kelly, who's a kind of sleazy sheriff, a corrupt sheriff, a bit like the sheriff that Gene Hackman plays in Unforgiven, right? And then there's a third brother called Amos, who's a kind of comic relief figure. He's this big, hulking, rather clumsy guy who keeps running around like a little boy, telling the other brothers what's going on. And it's their sort of family saga, their dynastic saga, that really the film is about. And it's the interaction between those two that is the most interesting thing in the movie. There are other elements in this film that are very peculiar. I'll just talk about one now. That is, this movie has a gay subtext. Now, I know what you're thinking. There you are. So you're sitting back with your beer and your Stetson hat and think, oh, here we go. This is what happens all the time these days. You know, these intellectuals, these liberal types come along with some newfangled idea about what this old-fashioned Western about. It's got a gay subtext. No, it really does. And it's very, very obvious. But what's even more interesting about it is the movie doesn't do anything with it. So they've got this businessman guy who runs the town. He's called Simon. And he has a kind of grand vizier, a factotum character called Carbo, who's dressed in the classic Western bad guy outfit, sort of very black hat and very black clothes. He looks a bit like Dirk Bogarde in that English Western where he wore leather. I can't remember the name of it. So he's this kind of sort of shadowy figure who helps Simon, you know, with his devious schemes to keep control of the town. And they have a sort of, it's a bit like they've got a marriage going on. There's a sense, for example, that Carbo doesn't just want to help Simon to get more money or to secure power, but is also caring for him, cares about his welfare and his feelings. It's very different from the usual bad guy henchman relationship. And what's interesting about this is the film points it up. But at the end of the movie, when the corrupt brothers are brought down and they're killed, Simon and the corrupt sheriff are killed, Randolph Scott rides off into the sunset, leaving Carbo, the Grand Vizier character, to take over the town. Even though throughout most of the movie he's quite a sleazy, dodgy figure. It's a weird part of the way this movie is working. It's kind of unresolved, and that's one of the reasons I like it. It makes it very realistic. You get this sense of real people who've got pasts and other elements in their lives, apart from what's just happening with Randolph Scott. And because it doesn't resolve itself, purely, according, good wins, bad loses. It gives a real raw feel to the film, which I kind of like, actually. So check it out, see what you think. Am I reading too much into it? I just think it's really interesting, and it's one of the many elements in this film that makes it much better than the sort of standard Western that it first appears to be. Now, in third place, I'm going to get a bit of flack here. I'm going to pick Decision at Sundown. Most people's least favourite film in the cycle. In fact, Randolph Scott himself said he made 2 mediocre westerns with Boetticher, Westbound and this one. I am going to try and mount a defence of this film because I really, really love it. It's an odd one out in the cycle. It's an interior domestic western. Unlike the others, which are mostly set out in the open, this one is set inside a town and mostly inside a saloon. And what happens is, Randolph Scott, once again, he has lost his wife, as in Ride Lonesome, as in Comanche Station. And he believes that this guy seduced her and it led to her death. So he's come to get him. In the meantime, this guy, Kimbrough, has become a leading sort of political figure in this city, right? And he's about to get elected, and he's also about to get married, so he's about to become a respectable member of society. And Randolph Scott wants to bring him down. Okay, that's the setup. But something interesting happens in this movie, right? First of all, there's an intimation that Scott is wrong. That in fact, his wife probably didn't love him. And that this was as much her decision as it was this Kimbrough's decision. And that Scott is seeing this all the wrong way. It's interesting. It's an interesting irony. You remember I was talking at the start of this video about the sexual tension of these movies. Well, most of the movies are written by Burt Kennedy. 7 Men From Now, Tall Tea, Ride Lonesome, Comanche Station, right? So this is one of the 2 that is not written by Burt Kennedy. And in this, the sexual politics slightly shifts. So it shifts away from Randolph Scott, more towards the female figure and the slightly rascally character. And what happens at the end of the film is that the rascal is kind of redeemed. He's allowed to live, and he goes off with the woman who's really in love with him, and he's really in love with her. And Randolph Scott's journey of revenge is not resolved. And in fact, by the end of the film, he's the least sympathetic character. He's actually a bit of a fool, still clinging on to this idea, of the truth about his wife, and still wanting revenge, and seeming somehow kind of pathetic. In fact, the most sympathetic character throughout the movie is played by Noah Beery, who is Randolph Scott's best friend in the movie. That's what I like about this movie. It's different. It's pushing down a different road. It reminded me, in a way, of this book, which I've talked about before, Charles Dickens' last complete novel, Our Mutual Friend. And the reason it does is because in Our Mutual Friend, there's these 2 characters, Bradley Headstone and Eugene Rayburn, and they're fighting over this same girl. And Bradley Headstone is a really committed, socially committed guy, very serious man, who wants to help the local children and sets up a school for them. And Eugene Rayburn is some smart-ass lawyer, member of high society, likes to smoke, likes to giggle, always trying to chat up the girls, right? So Bradley Headstone seems to be good and Eugene Wrayburn seems to be bad. But as the book develops, we see that Bradley Headstone is so serious, he's so pent up with fury, that he's not capable of love. He's not really capable of taking this girl on her own terms and being a partner. Whereas Wrayburn, for all his slight arrogance, and his cockiness, is a human being who can offer her genuine love. And so in a similar way, that's what Decision at Sundown is doing, right? It's taking that into the Western. People have criticised this movie because they say the villain, played by John Carroll, the womanizer guy in it, is a bit of a weak actor. I think that's probably true, but in some ways it helps the film, I think, because he is a man of weakness. He is a man who has a weakness for women. He has a weakness for looking for the easy way out and the scurrilous way out. And, it's contrasted with the strong actor that is Randolph Scott. But in this case, the strength of Randolph Scott is that's his weakness, that's his handicap. So I really like this movie. I think it takes the Western in a different place, and I think it's rather unfairly underrated. Give it a try. Now, in second place, Ride Lonesome. What a great title that is. This is the movie that everyone knows, isn't it? And, look, it's Sunday afternoon. You've got nothing to do. Slightly rainy outside. You've got a beer in your hand or a can of Coke. You've got your feet up on the stool. What's the movie you want to come up to have, enjoy your afternoon watching? Ride Lonesome. This is the perfect Sunday afternoon movie. It's just gorgeous. Randolph Scott is just absolutely perfect here. He's set off well against Pernell Roberts, who's the most jovial and likeable of all the villains in the films, I think. Karen Steele is the woman. Karen Steele is very beautiful. And she's filmed hilarious. Sometimes it's a morning scene and she'll go out in the morning and she's going, and you see her in profile and Pernell Roberts and a very young James Coburn are watching her, and Pernell Roberts goes, when a man sees a woman like that, he gets a feeling down deep inside. I love all that stuff. I think this is, in some ways, the most perfect Western. It's very pared down, this journey. Randolph Scott has captured this boy who's a brother of Lee Van Cleef, and he's taken him in for bounty, knowing that Lee Van Cleef is going to pursue him, and he really wants to get revenge on Lee Van Cleef for killing his wife. And so basically Randolph Scott is leading these people down a garden path. He's leading them into a trap. And Pernell Roberts, the villain, knows this and he's going along with it because he wants to collect the bounty as well. And it all leads to this fantastic end climax at this weird tree in this plain, the hanging tree. I think this is an incredibly enjoyable Western, beautifully paced, great action sequences. And one of the things I like about it is that the villain gets off. Like I'm saying that there's this kind of weird kind of half friendship between protagonist and villain in these movies. Well, in this movie, it comes to something. And eventually, Randolph Scott lets Pernell Roberts go on his way, and it lets him start a new life. And I love that, and it's a great ending to the movie. So Ride Lonesome, arguably the most enjoyable. I think it's the one that pretty much everyone watching this would like. But at number one, I have to pick a film that I've loved all my life, and I've seen it so many times, and that is The Tall T, which was actually the first of the renowned cycle after Seven Men from Now. Now, why do I love this film so much? It's all to do with the placement of Randolph Scott's character. At the start of the film, he rocks up at this sort of way station. Just a little diversion here. Way stations, like outposts where people can water their horses or take a break, they are the lodestone location of these films because they represent society in the wilderness, but they're not part of the wider society. And that's the sort of leanness of Burt Kennedy's script writing and Bud Boetticher's direction. So anyway, he turns up at this way station, and there's a kid, and the kid wants him to get some candy from town, and he sort of goes into town, happy-go-lucky, and this guy offers him a job looking after some cattle and horses, and he tries to break in a horse and he falls into a water trough. Then he has a fight with another guy, but he has to walk. He loses his horse in a bet, so he has to walk back to the way station with wet boots, and then he has to get picked up by the stagecoach. He's like a big child, really. But then they get back to the way station, and oh heck, it's been taken over by villains. Enter Richard Boone. Now, I love Richard Boone. I think he's a brilliant actor. He wasn't valued enough. He also appears as the lead actor in Gordon Douglas's fantastic western Rio Conchos. But here he is absolutely brilliant as the villain, the best villain in the series. And he and his men, they're two young lads, and they have killed the station master and the boy and dumped their bodies in a well. It's a very brutal film. It's got some darkness in it. And basically, they decide that they're going to kill Randolph Scott and the couple in the stage, which Randolph Scott has taken a lift on. And this couple are newlyweds. But then Richard Boone finds out that the wife is the daughter of a wealthy businessman in town, and he could ransom her. And this is actually suggested by her husband. So again, we've got a weak husband, right? So this is set up. And Randolph Scott is kidnapped by Boone and taken with him. Now the reason is, and this is one of the reasons I like this film so much, the reason Richard Boone saves Randolph Scott's life is because he likes him. This is a film about male friendship. It's about one man's liking for another man. And through Randolph Scott, he sees another life that he could have had, with a kind of man that he respects and wants to be. And a lot of the film is about Richard Boone and Randolph Scott talking to each other. And Richard Boone trying to tell Randolph Scott about this life. You know, he's with these two young hotshots who are very immature and are thrilled by women and killing. And Richard Boone is looking for something else. And that's one of the beautiful things about this film. It's actually a portrait of male friendship, but it's a male friendship stymied because they're obviously on different sides to each other. But it's also about something else. Let's go back to that sexual tension I was talking about. At the centre of this film is this woman who's being ransomed, played by Maureen O'Sullivan. Now, she is the most interesting heroine in these films. Why? Because she's middle-aged. She's not the sort of young babe that they usually put in these movies. She's a normal-looking, ordinary-looking woman. Rather cruelly throughout the film, she's called plain. That's about as plain a woman as I've ever seen. Like this. And this is interesting because she's going to become the love interest. This isn't some movie where some old-timer's kissing some young woman. This is a real woman, a proper partner for the middle-aged protagonist. And that's what's interesting. So you start with Randolph Scott in this kind of boyish, bumptious, I'm just a happy-go-lucky guy. And then he has to fight for his life. And then the sense of age and weariness and world wisdom comes into his character. And it comes in partly through the growing relationship and bond between him and this woman, played by Maureen O'Sullivan. And I like that. I think it's more true, it's more real. And it gives a greater warmth and truth in this film than you get in the other movies. And that's what I really love about this film. I love that relationship between Randolph Scott and Richard Boone. I love the relationship between Randolph Scott and Maureen O'Sullivan. That's the joy of the film. Set against these two young hotshots, these two bad guys, who are both very well played, actually. And that's why The Tall Tea is my personal favourite of these films. If you're in the UK, I strongly recommend this box set produced by Indicator, which has got the 5 proper renowned films on. Excellent. The work on the photography is absolutely incredible. They look beautiful. So thanks very much. I love talking about these movies. Let me know your rankings of them below and what you think of the whole cycle. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.